the irreversibility of time. What is time? What are processes that go one way but cannot go the other way? Why do we remember the past but we can't remember the future? This is a little bit of a daring project in this episode because I'm going into deep philosophical and physical questions of time. What is time? And the relationship I'm seeing here is with any kind of process where the past has enough information for the future and where we can go back and forth is fundamentally different than a process where we cannot do that. And most of life, most of the evolution of the planet and everything is the latter. So we can only go forward, we cannot go backward. This has to do with the second law of thermodynamics, where it says that entropy continuously increases, which, by the way, is not even that clear if that is a law, but right now it is. And fundamentally also, I think it has to do with creativity. I think creativity fits into this process because I would consider any process that involves creativity as irreversible. This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's August 4th, 2021. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is up 1.95%. The market's down 46 basis points. For the year, we are up 5.75%. The market is up 17.75%. We're underperforming by 12%. Today's contribution was primarily our biotech index. Tesla was flat. The biotechs are doing fine. They're increasing in value based on, in particular, the news that allogenic cell therapies have sparked interest from large pharma players. I believe also continuous success in the CRISPR technology and the news surrounded by it is driving the stocks higher. Now let's get to this question. Inspired by a podcast, Sean Carroll's podcast, Mindscape, he had David Wallace on. David Wallace is a physicist turned philosopher who thinks about time. Now, let's dissect this a little bit. This is important. I do admit that this is quite a leap for this podcast series, which is about how it feels to run a hedge fund. We're talking about time, irreversibility of time, entropy, creativity. But again, it is crucial to understand these processes when it comes to any kind of knowledge work, and the hedge fund business is a deeply knowledge-driven work. So that's why I think it's relevant. Now, what is time? Time in general is something that goes forward, that has a past, and that has a future. And the way we humans perceive time is typically by remembering the past and not knowing the future. And most of the time, I think that is exactly how life is for us, at least the way we perceive it. Now, in physics and philosophy, these concepts are not so clear, in particular because let's assume we live in a Newtonian world. Let's assume we live in a deterministic world, in a Laplacian world, where if we had all the information, then we would actually be able to predict the future from the past, and we could go back and forth, at least in principle. Now, I would say that quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and the theory of quantum physics is saying clearly that is not possible. We cannot go backwards. And the explanation that we have in quantum mechanics has to do with things like probabilistic outcomes, with different types of potential outcomes and things like that, which in that sense don't give us the information for the future. And also because it's probabilistic, if we go backwards, we might not get the same result. So we cannot go back and forth. And this is kind of how we perceive time. Now, in my view, the most reasonable explanation that I can gather from my perspective is the multiverse explanation, which kind of, according to David Wallace, says that, okay, well, we have in a microscopic world, we have these quantum effects that in principle make every time there is an entanglement between particles, the world or the universe or the reality splits. And in that sense, we have multiverse realities, and we humans, we perceive one type of reality, and we split into all these different types of realities, and that's kind of how what we think is probability. And I think probability is a very deep concept, also being discussed, let's say, by Arthur Eckert that I met, I think 3 years ago now at a winter school in about quantum cryptography in Switzerland. And he talked to me in particular about working on probability. I think probability, the concept of probability, the irreversibility of time, the irreversibility of events going from the future to the past and from the past to the future, all this has to do with probability. And I think the multiverse is one of the good explanations here. Now, in that sense, probability is simply our perception of the universe that we happen to be in. Seems random to us, but it's not really. If we had an overview over all the possible universes that got split through the entanglement of all the particles, we would not perceive probability. Then we would have full information about the state of the world, of the reality. It's just that because we are limited in our perception, that we have this illusion of probability. So in that sense, probability is an illusion. It's not, if you take mathematically, what is probability? It's outcome divided by all possible outcomes. Now, if you have, let's say you are some quantum demon that has all the possible outcomes, that has the overview over all possible universes, then the equation would be all possible universes divided by all possible universes. Probability is 1. So we would not have probabilities. That's the way I understand probability. Now, this is not about probabilities. This is about the gist of this particular episode is actually about creativity. And here's the arch that I'm trying to make from information about the state that we're in, so initial state, and the information about the initial state. Now, can we predict from the initial state what's going to happen? And my thesis is that the more creativity there is in the process, in the dynamics of the system, the less we can predict it, the less we can also reverse from the future to the past. In other words, we can remember the past, we cannot remember the future. In other words, we can't predict the future from the past. Now, this is a simple thing. Elon Musk has said that many times, that you should not reason by analogy, things like that. And why did he say that? He said that for the exact same reason that I'm saying it here. It is that he has a process where the initial state is clear. We know the initial state of Tesla, founder, lithium-ion batteries, whatever it was back then in 2002 or so when they founded Tesla. We have the information of the initial state. And we also know the dynamics, at least us investors that have been sticking around with Tesla for decades now. We know the dynamics, or at least we have a sense for the dynamics. But the thing is, we cannot predict where it's going. Impossible, because there's a lot of creativity involved. Creativity defined as a lot of potential outcomes. What does it have to do with physics? Of course, everything is physics. Everything that's possible will happen. Everything that will happen is possible, etc. We all believe in that. The multiverse is not really relevant for us in terms of making money. But what is relevant right now, here, as we speak, is the point that the more potential outcomes there are, the better the situation is for wealth generation. The more risky it is, the more volatile it is. I've said that many times on this podcast before. The more volatile a situation is, the better for us. Why is it volatile? It's because the market has a certain static perception. It does change over time, but it's pretty static. So if you have a very creative process, it starts being very volatilely, it starts being perceived in very different ways and angles from the market, by the market, and that creates volatility. In other words, if we don't have volatility, that means the static market perception reflects the actual perception of the dynamics of the process. In other words, the company reflects what the market thinks. And if that is the case, then we don't have a lot of creativity. But by definition, even though the market is the best way for us to assess values and things like that, it's still pretty static given or compared to the actual potential outcomes and the creativity in processes. So the more creativity we have, the more volatility, the more potential for wealth generation. Tesla is a good example. Our CRISPR index is a good example. I want to discuss, let's take CRISPR, for example. So we have a company like Intellia, which is doing in vivo experiments with CRISPR. So what they're doing is they're actually trying to deliver CRISPR into humans, into living tissue within a human, and fix a problem, a pharmaceutical problem. They've succeeded. So far, so good. Is that reversible? It's not reversible because there is creativity involved. There are potential outcomes involved. There are this was not predicted. We cannot predict this from the past by simply because this has never been done before. And there's no information in any kind of initial state of the past that gives us a deterministic way to predict this. What we do as investors is we take the initial states. Jennifer Doudna, Michel Charpentier invent CRISPR. CRISPR gets used in vivo in certain cells by David Liu and other Harvard people. So we start putting the dots together, as we say in English, to predict the future. But it is highly probabilistic. It's not random. That's why we have a job. We're not gamblers. It's not random. That's why we're comfortable putting large positions in those types of investments, because it's not random. But it is deterministic. It is not deterministic, and it is certainly it has a big component of randomness. This is fundamentally the way we see the investment process, the way we see ourselves as investors. This is fundamentally the way we perceive our work. We're seeking very creative processes that, on the other hand, have this component of still being able to at least comfortably assess what might happen. We can't predict. It's not deterministic. It's certainly not engineering. We're not building Golden Gate bridges here. We have to be very humble and very careful in terms of how we decide what we invest in, and we cannot be sure about the outcomes of the investments. But we have to assess the process, and the process of the initial states are important, but the process is kind of, that's where our work happens. The process, or how is the system dynamically expanding? And that's where we want to find this fine balance between probabilistic outcomes, creativity, and still being able to assess. This is exactly, in other words, we don't want, if it's completely random, deterministic, if it's crazy, if Jackson Pollock time painting, there's nothing we can do here. We have to, get our hands up. On the other hand, I keep using example like General Electric, General Mills. There is very little creativity there. There is, the processes, the initial state is known, and the dynamics of the system are very well known, and we know how the system will evolve. But there's so little creativity here that there's no potential for wealth generation. To finish this episode, I just want to reiterate again: in order to express creativity, you need freedom. Freedom and creativity are absolutely entangled. There is no such thing as creativity without freedom, and there's no such thing as freedom without creativity. Those two concepts are almost congruous. Freedom, creativity, wealth generation. Thank you.